the void before creation. In the absolute void before time, nothing stirs except the faint pulse of Nammu, the primeval sea. Imagine yourself floating in endless darkness where there is no up or down, no horizon, no sound, only the deep pressure of still water, infinite and eternal. It is from this silent abyss that the first awareness emerges like a ripple spreading across the face of an ocean that has never been disturbed. From Nammu's vast and unbroken body arise two principles, and the sky, boundless and stretching, beyond vision, and Kai, the earth, heavy, fertile, and waiting. Their union is not like the gentle joining of mortals, but a cosmic act that establishes the first boundary above and below light and dark, heaven and ground. This division is the first architecture of existence. From their embrace comes Enlil the wind and force, born with the power to thrust heaven and earth apart. It is not destruction, but an act of creation, the opening of space where air can circulate, where breath can exist. With this separation, the first possibility of life takes shape, and what was once a closed, formless world begins to expand with definition. But An and Kai are not content to stop at boundaries. From their union, and from Nammu's waters, new forces arrive. Enki, lord of the subterranean sweet waters, clever and full of hidden wisdom. Ninhursag, the mountain mother, steady as stone, whose body will one day provide fertile ground for crops and herds. Inanna, fierce and radiant, blazing with the contradictory forces of love and war. Utu, the golden sun who will mark the days and illuminate the path of justice. Nanna, the moon who softens the night and keeps the rhythm of months and tides. Around them gather countless others, each embodying a fragment of existence. The Mesopotamian people who told these stories thousands of years ago believed the universe itself was alive, each element infused with spirit and intention. The stars above were not cold and distant, they were eyes of the divine. The rivers that gave life to their fields, the Tigris and Euphrates, were not merely waters but arteries of gods pulsing with gifts and dangers. Every storm, every drought, every harvest was a message from beings far greater than humanity. From this vast company of divine forces, the gods established the Anunnaki, 50 great powers, who will decree fate-shaped laws and decide the order of the cosmos. Beneath them labor the Igigi, a host of 300 divine workers whose task is to carry out what the Great Ones decree. Like the first artisans in a vast construction site, they dig the channels of rivers, raise the foundations of temples, and ensure the divine blueprint is carried forward into matter. But for now, in this first stirring of creation, there is harmony. The cosmos is beautiful, newly formed, its scaffolding set. The heavens arch overhead like a dome of lapis lazuli, and the earth stretches below fertile and waiting, kissed by Enki's hidden waters. And yet though the gods marvel at what they have wrought, an emptiness remains. For what is order if there is no one to witness it? What is beauty if no voice can sing its praise? In these opening moments you can almost feel the weight of potential. The gods stand at the threshold of something immense, their powers newly defined, their domains freshly carved. They are creators, yes, but also rulers, and rulers need subjects. A quiet question echoes across the halls of heaven. What purpose shall this creation serve, and who will inhabit it? Thus begins the first of many debates that will shape the destiny of world. The waters still glisten, the winds still roam, the stars still glimmer above, but beneath this serenity lies the seed of conflict, of ambition, and of stories yet untold. The separation of heaven and earth. In the beginning the world was bound tightly together, heaven pressed close against the earth, as though Anunnaki could not release their embrace. There was no sky as we know it, no breath of air between, no place for life to stretch its limbs. It was Enlil who changed this forever. He was born from their union, the god of windstorm and authority. With a force both violent and purposeful, he thrust heaven upward and pressed earth downward, separating the two forever. This act was not destruction, but creation, a decisive rupture that made space for everything else to exist. Where there had been suffocating closeness, there was now air. Wind began to circulate. Space became possible. The first horizon was drawn, the first breath taken. It is no wonder that Mesopotamian scribes described Enlil with awe and unease, for in that single moment he demonstrated both the gift of freedom and the terror of power. The Sumerians believed Enlil embodied not only the winds that swept across their plains, but also the very concept of authority. He was not simply a god who controlled the elements. He was the executive force of order. Without Enlil, the cosmos would remain tangled, bound in shadow and silence. With him, it became structured with boundaries, layers, and command. He was both the air that filled lungs and the decree that no one could disobey. From this separation of sky and earth, the universe acquired shape. Heaven stretched upward, dazzling and remote, where An reigned as the Supreme Father. The earth broadened below solid and receptive, where Kai embodied the fertile ground. Between them, the open atmosphere became the realm of Enlil, who moved like the restless storm. Imagine how the early people of Mesopotamia would have seen this in their daily lives. The sudden sandstorm sweeping across their mud-brick cities, the winds howling through the reeds of the riverbanks, the invisible but overwhelming force that could strip roofs from temples, all were Enlil's domain. To them, his separation of heaven and earth was not a myth preserved only in words. It was experienced every day in the power of the wind itself. The act of separation also set a pattern for divine roles, and the Sky Father would rule from distant heights, serene and removed. Enlil, his son, would become the enforcer, the one who managed the world below, ensuring divine order extended into Earth's realm. This division of powers, supreme yet distant authority above practical command below, mirrored the structure of Mesopotamian society itself. Kings often traced their legitimacy to unclaiming heaven's sanction, but their rule was carried out in the spirit of Enlil through law's armies and the administration of cities. The cosmic order was no longer a formless whole, but a layered hierarchy. Heaven, earth, and the space in between each had their keeper. And with the opening of this atmosphere came the possibility for other beings, plants, animals, and eventually humans, to live and breathe. Enlil's act was therefore both terrifying and necessary. He imposed separation, but through that separation came life. Yet separation always carries tension. An and Kai, once united, were pulled apart, their embrace broken. Enlil may have created order, but he also set the stage for distance between gods and humans, between mortals, and immortality between heaven and earth. Every story that follows, every myth of longing, rebellion, or ambition emerges from this first act of division. It is the eternal paradox: to create space is also to create boundaries. From this moment forward, the gods would not only shape the world, but govern it, balancing closeness with distance, authority with compassion. And the question would always remain, how much space is necessary? And the first generation of deities. From the parted heavens and the opened earth, new deities arose, each embodying the forces that would give structure and meaning to existence. These were not abstract symbols, but living presences, gods whose character shaped the rhythm of life in Mesopotamia. First among them was Enki, lord of the subterranean waters. Beneath the surface of the land flowed hidden springs of sweet water, unseen but essential. Without them, crops withered, rivers dried, and cities faltered. Enki ruled this invisible domain, carrying wisdom as deep and mysterious as the aquifers he commanded. To the Mesopotamians, he was the clever problem solver, the one who could untangle divine quarrels or provide counsel when brute force failed. Beside him stood Ninhursag, the great mountain mother, whose body symbolized the highlands that bordered the fertile plains. She was a goddess of fertility, shaping not only the soil, but also the bodies of animals and humans. In her womb, new life was fashioned, and her mountain form anchored the landscape. Fields and harvests, herds and children, all were traced to her nurturing presence. Then came Inanna, a figure both dazzling and dangerous. She was the morning star and the evening star, Venus blazing in the sky. To mortals she embodied the fierce contradictions of life desire and destruction, passion and conflict. She was the goddess of love, fertility and sexuality, but also the patroness of war and conquest. Her dual nature made her unpredictable, yet irresistible. To her devotees in Uruk, she was the very pulse of vitality, a goddess who could seduce kings and topple empires. Utu, the sun rose each day to bathe the land in light. More than warmth and visibility, he represented justice and order. His blazing eyes saw every deed, honest or corrupt, and his cycles marked time itself, in a society where law codes would one day be carved in stone. Utu's presence foreshadowed the idea that truth was illuminated and wrongdoing could not hide in shadow. Beside him gleamed Nanna the moon, who brought calm silver light to the night and kept the cycles of months and tides. His gentle presence balanced Utu's intensity. In Mesopotamian thought, Nanna was a regulator of time, guiding rituals and harvests by his phases, a celestial clock that mortals could rely upon. Around these central deities clustered a host of others, minor gods, local spirits, patrons of specific trades or cities. But together they formed a pantheon that was more than a collection of personalities. They represented the cosmos, broken into pieces that humans could understand: water, earth, love, war, light, and rhythm. In these early generations, harmony still held sway. The gods were settling into their roles, their powers weaving together into a fragile balance. Yet even here, seeds of rivalry could be sensed. Inanna's ambition burned too brightly to remain content. Enlil's stern authority clashed with Enki's flexible cunning. Each domain was vital, but the gods themselves carried the flaws and passions of beings who could feel jealousy, pride, and hunger for influence. The people of Sumer would later preserve these stories on clay tablets scratched with cuneiform wedges. To them, these myths were not fanciful tales, but explanations of the living forces that shaped their world. When the Euphrates overflowed, they thought of Enki's waters rising. When harvests were plentiful, Ninher Sag's fertility was honored with offerings. When war erupted, it was Inanna's hand that stirred the spears. Thus the first generation of gods was not distant, abstract philosophy, but immediate reality. They walked through temples, whispered in dreams, and demanded devotion. They were as present as the rivers and as commanding as the mountains. And as they gathered in councils and set their thrones in order, they prepared to extend their influence beyond divine affairs into the lives of mortals yet to be created. Birth of the Anunnaki and Igigi. As the first pantheon of great deities settled into their roles, they faced a realization the cosmos was vast, and even gods could not govern its every detail alone. From this need for structure emerged two great collectives, the Anunnaki and the Igigi. The Anunnaki were 50 in number, the great ones, seated in solemn assembly to decree fate itself. They were not merely administrators, but cosmic judges presiding over the destinies of gods and mortals alike. In myth, they are portrayed as the High Council, the voices of law and balance. Their decrees were final etched into the very fabric of existence. When the Anunnaki spoke, reality obeyed. Beneath them stood the Igigi, a host of 300 younger gods, sometimes called the working powers. If the Anunnaki were rulers and judges, the Igigi were builders, engineers, and laborers. They dug the canals that carried Enki's waters to the fields, they raised the walls of temples, they kept the rhythms of divine order alive in the physical world. In this hierarchy, one sees a reflection of Mesopotamian society itself, where kings and priests issued decrees, but vast numbers of laborers carried out the work of sustaining cities. It is striking how closely these myths mirror the concerns of the people who told them. The Mesopotamians lived in a land where agriculture was both a blessing and a burden. The Tigris and Euphrates were lifelines, but they required endless effort, digging irrigation ditches, maintaining levees, repairing flood damage. In the same way, the Igigi are imagined as divine laborers, mirroring the struggles of human farmers and builders. Even in heaven, it seems toil was inescapable. The Anunnaki presided from lofty councils, but the Igigi sweated and strained. This balance of decree and execution established the first celestial bureaucracy. It reflected not only divine necessity but also human order. The temple states of Sumer were ruled by priest kings who claimed their authority descended from heaven. Laws were declared at the top, but clay tablets recorded contracts, rations, and debts, all executed by those beneath. At first, harmony prevailed. The Igigi labored and the Anunnaki judged. The gods watched with satisfaction as canals spread water across fields, temples rose toward the sky, and cosmic order extended into the fertile crescent. But the question lingered. Was this structure sustainable? Could even divine labor continue forever without resentment? The Sumerians who told these stories must have felt this tension deeply. They knew the weight of ceaseless work, harvesting in blazing heat, repairing dikes after a storm, hauling bricks for temple construction. Perhaps they projected their own frustrations onto the Igigi, imagining that even gods might grow weary of endless toil. For now, though, the hierarchy stood intact. The Anunnaki ruled with gravity, their judgments binding. The Igigi toiled in obedience, their hands shaping the world. Together they sustained the fragile order, born from the separation of heaven and earth. Yet beneath the surface, in the rhythm of work and the silence of weariness, something was beginning to stir, an unease that would one day break into open defiance. The cosmos had been built, but it had not yet been tested. Celestial hierarchy and its question. The universe now stood in layers, heaven above with an earth below, with Ki and the airy realm between governed by Enlil. Around them gathered the younger gods Enki, Ninhursag, Inanna, Utunanna, and the hosts of the Anunnaki and Igigi. Authority had been established, power distributed, duties assigned. The cosmos resembled a vast kingdom, ordered and stratified, each being knowing its place at the very top and reigned as supreme sovereign. He was distant, aloof, his authority rarely exercised directly, but absolute nonetheless. An was the silent witness, the source of ultimate legitimacy, much like a high king, who rarely descends from his throne, yet whose word could change the world. Beneath him, Enlil acted as the enforcer, the executive force of heaven's will. His presence was not passive, but immediate. He commanded storms, directed the winds, imposed discipline. If An represented the divine right to rule, Enlil embodied the daily machinery of power, the voice that issued decrees, the hand that wielded the rod of authority. And then there was Enki, counselor and contriver, who did not rule with thunder or decree, but with knowledge. He was the wise adviser who solved impossible problems, a voice of cunning where brute force faltered. In Enki, mortals and gods alike found a champion of reason and adaptation, the patron of invention, diplomacy, and survival. This triad, and the sovereign Enlil the enforcer, Enki the counselor, formed the backbone of the divine hierarchy. Around them, other gods contributed their domains. Ninhursag nurtured fertility, and mountains Inanna embodied love and war. Utu lit the path of justice, and Nanna marked time by the moon. It was a balanced cosmos, orderly and carefully maintained. Yet, in the midst of this balance arose a question: what will they govern? The heavens were splendid, the earth fertile, the rivers flowing, the stars shining, but without beings to recognize this beauty, without voices to offer worship, what meaning did it hold? It is here that the myth steps beyond cosmology into philosophy. The gods were mighty, but what is without subjects? What is creation without witness? Like kings without citizens, like poets without readers, their majesty demanded an audience. The very structure of the pantheon implied rule, but rule over whom? To the Sumerians this was not an idle question, but one deeply tied to their lived reality. Their cities were ruled by priest-kings who mediated between divine will and human labor. The temple or ziggurat was both palace and shrine, where gods and mortals met in ritual exchange. Without people to farm, build, sacrifice, and pray, even the grandest temple would be an empty shell. So too in the heavens the gods required service, recognition, and the steady rhythm of devotion. Thus the seeds of humanity's creation were sown not as a sudden inspiration, but as the logical extension of hierarchy. The gods had fashioned order, assigned duties, and built councils. What was to fill the world with beings who could sustain that order, beings who could provide the labor and worship that the divine realm itself now required. The cosmos, for all its grandeur, was not complete. It lacked caretakers, it lacked witnesses. And so the Great Council turned its thoughts toward the crafting of a new species, one fragile yet enduring, one obedient yet capable, one destined to both serve and challenge the gods themselves. The Igigi revolt. For long cycles the Igigi labored under the weight of divine command. They dug canals across the Mesopotamian plain, their tools striking into clay as though carving veins into the very body of the earth. They raised temples brick by brick, hauling heavy loads under relentless sun, their sweat mingling with the soil. Though immortal, they were not inexhaustible. Endless toil stretched before them like an unbroken horizon, and with each passing age, weariness settled into their spirits. At first, they endured in silence, but silence, when pressed too long, becomes dissent. Whispers moved among them like reeds stirring in hidden wind. Why must they labor without rest while the great Anunnaki sat in council decreeing but never lifting a hand? Why should their eternity be consumed by toil? These murmurs thickened into resentment, and resentment hardened into resolve. The revolt of the Igigi was not chaos, but coordination. They refused to continue their labor, casting down their tools and halting the flow of divine projects. Canals went unfinished, temple walls stood incomplete, and the great design of the gods faltered. It was the first strike in celestial history, a rebellion not of violence, but of refusal. The very machinery of creation ground to a halt. The Anunnaki were stunned. The ordered cosmos they had carefully built suddenly trembled, not from natural disaster, but from within. Authority had been challenged not by rival gods, but by their own workers, their own enforcers of will. Enlil, whose instinct was discipline, roared with fury. His storms could break mountains, and his first impulse was punishment to crush the rebellion with overwhelming force. Yet the question remained, what good was order, if those bound to sustain it were unwilling? Enki has always offered another vision. Where Enlil saw insubordination, Enki saw opportunity. If the Igigi would no longer labor, then perhaps new beings could be shaped to take their place. Beings weaker than gods, yet strong enough for toil. Beings mortal, so they would never rise to rival their creators. Beings who, in their worship, would not only work, but also sustain the very dignity of divine rule. Thus the crisis of rebellion became the seed of invention. Humanity would not be an accident nor merely an act of divine generosity. It would be a solution to a problem, a compromise between the fury of Enlil and the cunning of Enki. In the discontent of the Igigi, the destiny of mankind was conceived. The Mesopotamians who heard these stories may have smiled with recognition. They too lived in societies where the powerful decreed and the laborers bore the weight. They knew what it meant to sweat under command, to carry bricks for ziggurats that would never be their own. Perhaps in telling of the Igigi's rebellion, they gave voice to feelings they themselves could not express. The myth offered both a mirror and an explanation. If life was toil, it was because gods themselves had once shifted their burdens downward. In this way, rebellion was not the end of order, but its transformation. From the fatigue of the Igigi would come the clay of humanity. From their refusal would rise the destiny of mortals. And so what began as dissent would become the foundation for an entirely new chapter of creation. Creation of humanity. Faced with the mutiny of the Igigi, the gods gathered in council to decide the fate of labor itself. Enlil thundered for punishment, desiring obedience restored by force. But Enki, always the strategist, offered a different solution. Why not shape a new kind of being, lesser than gods yet capable of toil mortals, who could shoulder the burdens the Igigi cast aside? The idea was radical, but it resonated. In a moment that would alter the course of all history, the gods turned to clay, the very substance of Mesopotamia's world. Along the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates, clay was everywhere the medium for bricks pottery and tablets that recorded memory. It was soft yet enduring, humble yet transformative. Into this humble earth, the gods pressed their divine will. From clay they formed bodies, but bodies alone were lifeless. To animate them, Enki infused the form with the breath of life, a whisper of divine essence drawn from the subterranean waters. Other gods contributed too. Ninhursag shaped bones and wombs. Inanna stirred passion and desire. Utu lit the spark of awareness, and Nanna marked the rhythm of cycles within their flesh. Each deity lent a fragment of their nature, so that humanity was not born of one god, but of many. The result was something astonishing: creatures of earth, who walked upright, who breathed, who spoke. They were neither immortal, like the gods, nor powerless like animals. They stood in the space between fragile yet enduring, immortal, yet touched by the divine. The Sumerians described humanity as a blend of clay and breath, a material foundation infused with a spark of eternity. Yet their purpose was clear labor. The gods had not created humankind to rule or to rival, but to serve. Mortals would tend the canals, raise the temples, harvest the fields, and in doing so, sustain the order the gods desired. Their lives would be short, their strength limited, but their numbers would multiply, ensuring the world never again fell silent or stagnant. And more than labor, they were given the duty of worship. Through offerings and rituals, humans would feed the gods not with bread and water, but with reverence. Their prayers would rise like smoke, nourishing divine pride and confirming the hierarchy. For a time, this relationship was intimate. Gods walked among mortals, teaching them skills. Enki instructed irrigation and craft. Ninhursag taught midwifery and the care of fields. Inanna stirred the arts of love and battle. Utu revealed the cycles of justice. Thus the first civilizations were born as acts of divine pedagogy. Humanity did not stumble blindly into agriculture or kingship. In myth, they were guided. And this reflects the truth of Mesopotamian culture. Knowledge was never considered purely human. It was seen as a gift passed down from above, encoded in sacred decrees, preserved in rituals and temples. But woven into this gift was also a limitation. Unlike the gods, humans would die. Their lives would pass quickly like shadows across the plain. Mortality was not an accident, but a design, a safeguard, ensuring that servants could never rise to rival masters. Life was granted, but with an end fixed from the beginning. And so humanity emerged fragile, mortal, burdened with labor, yet capable of wonder. To the Mesopotamians, this explained everything: why life was hard, why death was inevitable, why temples demanded endless offerings. To live was to serve, but to serve was also to participate in the great cosmic order. In clay and breath, the gods had solved their dilemma. The Igigi were freed from toil, the Anunnaki retained their authority, and the earth was filled with new beings who would carry the weight of both labor and devotion. Humanity had been born not as an accident, but as the deliberate answer to rebellion, cities, and kingship. With humanity fashioned from clay and divine breath, the gods introduced not only survival, but civilization. They did not scatter humans aimlessly across the plains, but gathered them into settlements, shaping order from chaos. The first of these was Eridu, rising above the sweet springs of Enki. Here water flowed pure and abundant, and Enki himself walked among mortals, teaching them the arts of irrigation and canal building, the secrets of pottery and carpentry, the wisdom of writing etched upon clay. From Eridu the patterns spread. Nippur rose as Enlil's sacred city, a place where divine authority radiated from temple walls. Uruk under Inanna blazed with energy, its ziggurats towering toward heaven, its markets alive with trade, its festivals resounding with song and dance. Inanna herself presided over love, fertility, and war, her presence felt in every celebration and every conquest. Each city was not only a home for mortals, but a dwelling for gods. Temples became the intersection of heaven and earth spaces where rituals renewed the bond between clay-born servants and their divine masters. Priests interpreted omens, kings offered sacrifices, and the people labored to ensure their gods were honored with abundance. In this age, intimacy between gods and mortals was strong. Deities walked openly among their worshippers. They taught agriculture, revealed the patterns of the stars, instructed in the forging of bronze, the weaving of cloth, the shaping of song. Humanity was fragile, but with divine tutors they flourished. From heaven descended kingship, bestowed as a sacred office. Kings were not mere warlords, they were mediators entrusted with translating celestial will into earthly action. Their crowns and scepters symbolize the authority of An and Enlil, while their duty was to maintain order, ensure justice, and guard the temples. This golden age was not without tension. The closeness of gods and mortals blurred boundaries. Humans, once fashioned for labor, now walked with deities, shared in their wisdom, and tasted power once reserved for heaven. The relationship, while intimate, carried the seeds of future conflict. Too much closeness threatened awe. Too much knowledge threatened hierarchy. Still in those early days, the arrangement seemed harmonious. Canals shimmered under the sun, cities thrived with grain, and flocks' temples filled with hymns. Civilization itself was presented as a divine gift, a system where humanity could flourish, provided it remembered its place and kept its gods at the center of every act. The Sumerians who told these stories saw their own lives reflected here. To them, city and temple were inseparable labor and ritual indistinguishable. To farm was to honor Enki, to build was to exalt Enlil, to fight was to invoke Inanna. Kingship was not human ambition, but a trust from above. Civilization with all its burdens, and Inanna and the me. Yet among the gods, one figure could not remain still. Inanna, goddess of love and war, of desire and conquest, was restless. She looked upon Eridu, where Enki kept the me, the divine decrees that governed civilization itself. These me were not merely symbols, but living powers, kingship music, weaving law, warfare, wisdom, and more. Whoever held them could shape the destiny of mortals and gods alike. Enki guarded them in his city, secure in the belief that their distribution should be slow and careful. Civilization required order, and order required limits. But Inanna longed for more for her city, for herself, for humanity. So she went to Eridu, and with cunning and charm she approached Enki. She offered him hospitality, but when he responded in kind, she pressed her advantage. The myths describe a feast where Enki drank deeply, growing intoxicated. Inanna, bright-eyed and relentless, coaxed from him the me one by one. In his drunken generosity he handed them over, not realizing what he had surrendered. Once she held them, Inanna did not linger. She mounted her boat and raced toward Uruk, her city. When Enki sobered and realized what had happened, his fury surged. He sent messengers and creatures to pursue her, but Inanna was clever and determined. She repelled each attempt, fending off the forces sent to reclaim the decrees. At last she arrived in Uruk with the me secure. Her triumph elevated her city, making it the center of culture, artistry, and law. Uruk thrived as the beating heart of Mesopotamia, a place where music, poetry, and kingship flourished under her blessing. This tale is not only one of theft, but of transformation. The Sumerians saw in it the truth that civilization spreads through daring, cunning, and ambition, as much as through decree. Inanna's act was dangerous, even reckless, but it ensured that the richness of human life did not remain locked in one city under one god's careful watch. Instead, it spread vibrant and alive, carried into the heart of Uruk. It also revealed a deeper philosophical rift between Enki and Enlil. Enlil valued strict hierarchy, distance, and discipline. Enki favored adaptation, wisdom, and compromise. Inanna, with her audacity, tilted the balance, forcing change through boldness. The me were not meant to be hoarded, they were meant to be lived. Thus, civilization advanced not only by decree from above, but also by the restless ambition of those unwilling to wait. The story of Inanna and the me captures the spirit of invention itself. Knowledge must be seized, carried, and reshaped, even if it means defying order. Noise of civilization and Enlil's fury. Uruk flourished under Inanna's triumph. Its temples gleamed with offerings, its streets rang with the hammers of artisans, and its markets bustled with grain, wool, and copper. Other cities, too, began to multiply across the plain: Eridu, Nippur, Lagash, Kish. Each one raised ziggurats to the heavens and proclaimed its patron deity. The world of mortals was no longer quiet. It pulsed with voices, the clatter of tools, the cries of livestock, the chants of priests. At first, the gods rejoiced. Humanity had taken up its burden. Fields were green with barley, canals shimmered with water, temples filled with prayers. But with growth came noise. It was not simply the sound of life, it was the roar of ambition, the hum of countless voices weaving together into a chorus too loud to ignore. To mortals, this was vitality. To the gods, especially to Enlil, it was disruption. Enlil had always stood for authority, order, and distance. He valued reverence, not familiarity, hierarchy, not clamor. Yet now, night after night, the clamor of humanity rose into the heavens. The voices of cities reached the divine council, like the buzzing of endless insects, like a swarm with no rest. To Enlil it was unbearable. The tablets describe his anger vividly. He could not sleep for the noise of mortals. Their songs, their quarrels, their laughter all struck him not as worship, but as insolence. Civilization, instead of affirming divine majesty, seemed to blur the boundaries. Humanity had multiplied too quickly, filled the land too densely, and grown too bold in its nearness to the gods. This was more than irritation, it was philosophy. Enlil believed that too much closeness between heaven and earth endangered the very structure of the cosmos. Without distance, there could be no awe, no obedience. If mortals thought themselves too near to the divine, they might forget their role as servants and start to imagine themselves equals. For Enlil, silence was sacred and noise was rebellion. Other gods did not share his view. Enki, always sympathetic, argued that humanity's vitality was proof of success. Mortals were fulfilling their design-building, worshipping, creating order. Their voices to him were not noise, but a kind of music, a chorus of devotion mixed with life. Yet Enlil's patience had already worn thin. Where Enki saw promise, Enlil saw danger. The conflict between them reflected a deeper tension in Mesopotamian thought. Civilization was both a gift and a threat. The Sumerians themselves built vast cities, yet they also feared the instability that came with them: famine, when canals failed, war, when kings grew greedy, divine wrath, when rituals lapsed. The myths captured this duality order as blessing, excess as peril. Enlil's fury grew until it hardened into resolve. He would not tolerate the unending din of human clamor. He would act not with storms or plagues alone, but with something greater, something final. If mortals could not restrain themselves, then the gods would restrain them with silence, the silence of destruction. And so in the halls of heaven, Enlil prepared to persuade the divine assembly. His voice thundered with conviction: the world must be cleansed and humanity reduced. The flood, vast and unrelenting, began as an idea in his mind, a solution to the unbearable chorus of human noise. The flood decree. In the celestial court, Enlil's discontent boiled over into decree. He stood before the Anunnaki, his voice like thunder rolling across the horizon. Humanity, he declared, had overstepped its bounds. Their numbers had multiplied, their noise had grown unbearable, their clamor desecrated the quiet sanctity of heaven. Order itself was at risk. The other gods listened in unease. They too had felt the rising tide of humanity's presence. Mortals crowded temples with offerings, yet they also filled the land with noise, quarrels, and ambition. Civilization, once a gift, now pressed against the fragile boundary between divine and mortal. Enlil's solution was simple and terrible: a great cleansing. Not plague, not famine, not selective punishment, but flood, absolute and unrelenting. Rain from above, waters bursting from the earth below, winds tearing across the plains. Humanity in its entirety would be drowned, their cities swept away, their voices silenced forever. The council hesitated. The memory of creation was still fresh. Had they not shaped humans for this very purpose, to serve and worship, to labor and build? To destroy them entirely seemed both drastic and final. But Enlil's authority was immense, his argument persuasive. Civilization's vitality, he claimed, was not devotion, but defiance. To preserve cosmic order, mortals must be extinguished. The decision was reached: the deluge would come. It would rage for 6 days and nights, tearing away the noise of humanity until only silence remained. The Igigi, once burdened with labor, would be spared the din of mortal clamor. The Anunnaki, seated in their authority, would rule without disruption, and Enlil himself would restore the sacred distance he believed essential to divinity. The Mesopotamians who told this story lived with the constant memory of flood. Each spring, the Tigris and Euphrates swelled with unpredictable violence. Fields could be ruined overnight, homes swept away, lives lost in torrents of water. To them, a flood was not just natural disaster, it was the hand of heaven. The myth of the great deluge wove these fears into cosmic narrative. If the rivers could rise so suddenly, perhaps it was because the gods themselves had chosen to cleanse the land. But in the shadows of the council chamber, not all were convinced. Enki, lord of wisdom and subterranean waters, sat silent, troubled. His heart recoiled from the decree. Humanity was fragile, flawed, but also full of promise. To wipe them away seemed a waste, a cruelty that wisdom could not endorse. He did not yet speak, but within him the seeds of defiance stirred. The flood was decreed, the fate of humanity sealed. Yet in that silence after judgment, one god already considered a different path, Enki's secret warning. The council of gods had spoken, and Enlil's decree thundered over creation like the promise of a storm yet unseen. A flood would come, and with it the end of humanity. The decision was binding. To defy it openly was to challenge the authority of heaven itself. And yet, in the silence that followed, one god could not rest. Enki, master of wisdom and hidden waters, looked upon mortals with compassion. He had been present when clay was shaped and breath bestowed. He had taught them the channels of irrigation, the crafts of survival. To let them perish entirely was to undo the very labor of creation, to let order dissolve into waste. Enlil's wrath demanded silence, but Enki's conscience whispered resistance. Still, defiance required cunning. He could not stand against Enlil openly, nor could he persuade the assembly once the decree was sealed. Instead, he turned to secrecy, to the art of speaking without speaking. Enki was the patron of riddles and hidden counsel. His voice traveled in dreams, in murmurs, in signs understood only by the wise. Through such veiled channels he sought a single human worthy of survival. That human was Ziusudra, known later in Akkadian texts as Utnapishtim, a righteous king attentive to divine will, faithful in ritual, wise enough to hear the whispers of the unseen. To him, Enki directed a warning, but not in words of open rebellion. Instead, Enki spoke through the reeds of a hut, murmuring as though to the walls themselves. "Reed, wall, pay attention, listen. A great flood is coming. Tear down your house, build a vessel. Forsake possessions, save life. Take seed of every creature aboard and seal it tight against the waters." The instructions were precise. The vessel was to be immense, sealed with pitch strong enough to withstand both the rising waters from below and the rains from above. Its shape was not like the slender boats of fishermen, but more like a great cube or chest, a sealed container of survival. Within it, Ziusudra would gather his family, his livestock, and the seeds of all plants, life itself, distilled into cargo. To the Sumerians who heard this tale, the details carried resonance. They lived in a world where floods were sudden and devastating, where survival often depended on the strength of boats or the storage of grain. The idea of a sealed vessel, watertight and enduring, spoke to their lived fears and hopes. Ziusudra obeyed without hesitation. He dismantled his house to build the ark, sacrificing his home to preserve life. Day by day, beams were lifted, pitch was poured, and the frame of salvation rose against the sky. Neighbors must have watched with confusion, perhaps even mockery. Why build such a monstrous ship upon dry land? Yet Ziusudra worked in silence, guided by divine whisper, knowing that every plank nailed into place was defiance against extinction. Meanwhile, the heavens grew heavy, the air thickened with the promise of storm. The Euphrates swelled in its banks as though restless, preparing for release. And above the council of gods waited Enlil's fury, sharpening like a blade, while Enki's secret burned quietly, a flicker of hope hidden beneath the shadow of doom. The great deluge. The appointed day arrived, and with it the heavens broke. The skies, once held back by Enlil's command, split open. Rain poured in sheets endless and merciless, as though the very dome of heaven had cracked and collapsed upon the earth. At the same time, the subterranean waters of Enki's domain burst upward, fountains of the deep surging through soil and stone. From above and below, the world was drowned. For 6 days and 7 nights the storm raged. Winds howled like furious beasts, tearing roofs from temples, uprooting palms and hurling them into the torrent. The sound was deafening thunder, crashing waters, roaring timbers, groaning as cities crumbled. Temples that had stood for centuries were swept away in hours. Statues of gods toppled into the flood, swallowed by the very waters that the divine council had unleashed. The Ark of Ziusudra floated upon the chaos, its timbers groaning under the weight of survival. Inside, huddled in darkness, were the remnants of life families, clutching one another, animals restless in their stalls, seeds stored in jars, all trembling with the storm's violence. Every wave threatened to capsize them, every gust to splinter the vessel. Yet the pitch held the beams endured, and the ark drifted like a lone star upon a blackened sea. Meanwhile, even the gods felt fear. The flood was Enlil's decree, but the destruction surpassed what many had imagined. In myths, the gods are said to have recoiled, retreating to the high heavens, weeping at the devastation below. They trembled not at humanity's defiance, but at their own decision. For the waters showed no mercy, and in them the temples that had once fed the gods with offerings vanished. Hunger gnawed at divinity as much as grief gnawed at mortals. The Mesopotamians who preserved this tale knew the terror of sudden flood. Each spring, waters rose with a force that no levee could always contain. Fields turned to swamps, houses, to wreckage families, to refugees. The story of the Great Deluge magnified that lived reality into cosmic judgment. What they endured seasonally, they imagined universally, a flood so total that only one vessel remained drifting in silence above a world erased. At last, after the 7th night, the winds stilled. The rains ceased, the fountains of the deep closed. The sea of chaos stretched wide and silent, its surface littered with debris. Broken beams drowned animals, fragments of once proud cities. Slowly, the waters began to sink, and the ark came to rest upon a mountain's peak, tilted but unbroken. Ziusudra emerged blinking into the light. The world was empty, hushed, devastated. He built an altar and offered sacrifice, the smoke curling upward into the still air. It was not only thanksgiving for survival, but also a summons, a signal to the gods that life endured, that worship would continue. High above the divine assembly watched. The silence after the flood was profound, but in that silence something shifted. The gods could not deny the enormity of what they had done. They had silenced humanity, but at a cost even they could scarcely bear. After the flood, a new covenant, When the waters finally withdrew, the land lay bare and broken. Once great cities had vanished beneath layers of mud. Fields that once glittered with barley were drowned in silt. The plains stretched out in eerie silence, broken only by the cry of distant birds searching for perches that no longer stood. Humanity, once countless and clamorous, had been reduced to a single survivor and his kin. Upon the mountain's peak, Ziusudra offered his sacrifice. From the altar rose the scent of roasted meat and incense, a fragrance drifting upward like a plea for recognition. The smoke curled toward the heavens where the gods had gathered an assembly, now restless with regret. They had silenced the earth, but in that silence they themselves felt hunger, for without mortals who would sustain them with offerings, without temples who would give meaning to their dominion, Enlil beheld the sacrifice and at first raged. A survivor. How had a mortal escaped the flood that was meant to erase them all? His decree had been absolute. To see Ziusudra alive seemed a challenge to his authority, but Enki stepped forward calm and deliberate, reminding the council that survival was not rebellion, but necessity. Without mortals there could be no worship, no labor, no recognition of divine order. Gradually, even Enlil relented. His wrath gave way to recognition. Total annihilation had cost too much. What was order without devotion? What was sovereignty without subjects? The gods, chastened, forged a new covenant. Humanity would be restored, but under stricter conditions. First, their lives would be shortened. No longer would mortals enjoy endless vitality. Their span would be measured, their years limited. Death, which had always shadowed humanity, would now be inescapable, ensuring that no human could ever rival divine permanence. Second, their capacities would be restrained. Humans would have strength enough to labor, cunning enough to build, and passion enough to worship, but not the power to threaten heaven. Ambition would be tempered by fragility, and mortality would remind them of their place. Third, intimacy between gods and mortals would be less direct. No longer would deities walk casually through the streets, teaching face to face. Instead, the bond would be mediated by ritual, kingship, and priesthood. Temples would rise again, but now as thresholds, not dwelling places. Dreams, omens, and sacrifices would bridge the distance, maintaining reverence, even as familiarity waned. To the Sumerians who told this tale, these conditions explain the shape of their own lives. Why did humans die young compared to the eternal stars? Why was life filled with toil yet graced with moments of joy? Why were gods present in temples and rituals, but rarely seen in flesh? The covenant answered. The flood had redrawn the relationship. Mortals would endure, but within limits. Thus began the age after the Deluge, when humanity rebuilt from mud and memory. Ziggurats rose again, kingship descended once more from heaven, and fields were tilled by hands that knew both the fragility of life and the strength of survival. The gods had withdrawn, but not abandoned. They watched from afar, their pride tempered by loss, their authority reshaped by compromise. Humanity, though smaller and more fragile, would persist. And in their persistence they would honor the gods not only with offerings, but with the resilience of clay molded anew after ruin. The flood had been both punishment and renewal, destruction and creation, Out of silence a new order had Inanna's descent to the underworld. Even after the flood, when humanity rebuilt under new limits, not all divine restlessness was stilled. Among the gods, Inanna remained ambitious, driven by desires that could not be contained within the walls of Uruk or the worship of mortals. She had stolen the me, elevated her city, and basked in the adoration of festivals. Yet still her eyes turned toward realms unclaimed. The underworld, the shadowed kingdom of the dead, ruled by her sister Ereshkigal, drew her gaze. It was a place of silence, dust, and finality, where kings and beggars alike wandered without distinction. For Inanna, goddess of life, love, and battle, the thought of descending into that realm was both perilous and irresistible. Perhaps she sought to extend her authority beyond the living, perhaps to confront her own limits, or perhaps only to test the boundaries of power. Adorned in splendor, Inanna prepared herself for the journey. Upon her body she placed 7 sacred regalia, each a symbol of dominion. A crown upon her head, a necklace at her throat, beads across her chest, a breastplate of power, bracelets of authority, a golden rod of rulership, and a shimmering robe that marked her majesty. Each item was not only adornment, but the essence of her identity. With these, she approached the 7 gates of the underworld. At each gate, a guardian demanded surrender. First her crown, then her necklace, then her beads. One by one, the tokens of power were stripped away until the goddess, who entered in majesty, became the woman who stood naked, vulnerable, and bare. It was a ritual of undoing, a reminder that no matter how mighty before death, all are equal. Finally, she arrived before Ereshkigal, her sister cloaked in shadow, her throne heavy with sorrow and judgment. Here Inanna's ambition faltered, for in the underworld no bargaining availed her, no charm could shield her. Ereshkigal's gaze pierced her, and Inanna was transformed not into a conqueror, but into a corpse lifeless, hung upon a hook. This myth was more than a tale of rivalry. To the Sumerians it spoke of the cycle of life itself. The stripping at the gates mirrored the harvesting of crops. What grows tall and adorned with abundance must be cut down, its treasures surrendered before renewal can come. Inanna's descent symbolized the journey of fertility itself, descending into dormancy, awaiting the return of spring. Above her absence was felt keenly. Uruk mourned the temples, silenced the fields withered. Without Inanna passion dimmed, and the land itself seemed bereft. For even gods, it seemed, were bound by the laws of descent and death. Inanna's journey to the underworld was not simply punishment nor curiosity alone. It was a confrontation with the ultimate boundary, where power ends, where beauty fades, where even divine ambition meets its limit. And in that confrontation, the seeds of transformation were sown, rescue and substitution. Inanna hung lifeless in the underworld, her body suspended on a hook, her radiance extinguished. The world above languished in her absence. Crops faltered, lovers quarreled without reconciliation, wars dulled without passion, and the festivals of Uruk fell into silence. A goddess of vitality gone meant that life itself grew thin and brittle. Her faithful servant Ninshuba had not forgotten her charge. Before descending, Inanna had instructed her handmaiden, if she did not return, seek help from the great gods, and so Ninshuba, steadfast and loyal, went first to Enlil and then to Nanna. Yet both refused to intervene. Death was the ultimate law, they argued. To overturn it would upset the order of all things. At last, Ninshubur turned to Enki, whose compassion stirred where others' authority held firm. Enki could not descend himself, but he crafted a solution born of cunning. From the dirt beneath his fingernails he shaped two beings, neither male nor female, neither alive nor fully dead. They were liminal creatures slipping between categories unnoticed by the laws that bound gods and mortals alike. To them he entrusted food and water of life, the power to restore what death had taken. These strange emissaries entered the underworld unchallenged, their ambiguous forms granting them passage. They approached Ereshkigal, who sat upon her throne in agony, writhing with the pains of birth or grief. Scholars debate which the myth suggests. The emissaries did not demand or command. Instead, they did what no one had done. They empathized. They echoed her cries, mirrored her sorrow, gave voice to her pain. For the first time, Ereshkigal was seen not as a ruler of shadows, but as a suffering being. Moved by their compassion, she granted them a gift. They asked for Inanna's body, and with reluctance, Ereshkigal consented. The food and water of life were applied, and slowly the goddess stirred. Breath returned, flesh-warmed eyes opened. Inanna, once stripped of power and dignity, rose renewed. Yet her release carried a cost. None could leave the underworld without replacement. Such was its law, balance must be preserved. Inanna restored was bound to choose another to descend in her place. As she rose back into the world of light, she searched for a substitute. When she found Dumuzi, her beloved seated on a throne in finery, untouched by mourning, her heart hardened. Others had grieved her absence, torn garments and sung laments, but Dumuzi reclined as though untouched by loss. In anger, she marked him as her substitute. Demons of the underworld seized him, dragging him down to the shadowed halls. Yet even this was not final. Through the intercession of his sister Geshtinanna, a compromise was reached. Dumuzi would not remain in the underworld forever. Instead, he and his sister would alternate, the young shepherd spending part of the year in darkness and part in the world above. Thus began the cycle of seasons, his descent marking the barrenness of winter, his return heralding spring's renewal. The Sumerians saw in this myth a reflection of their world. Crops flourished, then withered only to bloom again. Life and death were not opposites, but partners in rhythm, each feeding the other. Inanna's descent and Dumuzi's substitution became a cosmic drama, explaining why the world blossoms and fades, why grief and joy are intertwined, why even gods are bound by cycles of loss and return. Inanna returned, changed, no longer the unchecked goddess of ambition, but one who had tasted death, endured vulnerability, and learned that even power bends before sacrifice. From her descent emerged not only wisdom, but the very pattern of life itself, the truth that renewal is born only through surrender and that every ascent requires a descent. Gilgamesh and Enkidu. In the age after the flood and after Inanna's descent, stories turned from the gods themselves to those beings who bridged the gulf between mortal and divine. Among them was Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, whose name would echo across centuries. 2/3 god and 1/3 mortal, he embodied contradiction mighty beyond ordinary men, yet still marked by human limits. His city walls towered high, his temples gleamed, his rule was unrivaled. And yet for all his strength and glory, he was restless, lonely, and prone to arrogance. The people of Uruk both admired and feared him. He demanded labor without pause, taking the youth into endless building projects, exhausting the men, and claiming privileges over women. They prayed to the gods for relief from a ruler too powerful, too untamed. And the gods listened. To temper Gilgamesh, they decided to create an equal, not to destroy him, but to balance him. From the clay of the wilderness came Enkidu, a wild man shaped by the gods covered in hair, drinking at watering holes with gazelles roaming the open steppe, free of walls and laws. He was raw vitality, untouched by civilization. Yet even he was destined to be drawn into the orbit of Uruk. A hunter who encountered him sought help, and a temple priestess, Shamat, was sent. Through her touch, her words, her companionship, Enkidu was transformed. From her he learned the arts of bread and beer, the rituals of love, and the ways of human society. In his body, civilization began to take root. When Enkidu entered Uruk, he found Gilgamesh in the midst of his pride. Their meeting was not gentle, it was a clash of titans. They grappled in the streets, their strength shaking the foundations of the city. Neither could overcome the other. But in the very heat of battle, respect was born. Their struggle ended not in enmity, but in laughter, breathless and shared. From that day, they were inseparable, two halves of a single whole. Gilgamesh, once alone in his might, now found in Enkidu a companion who understood him, who could stand beside him as equal. Enkidu, once wild and solitary, found in Gilgamesh a brother who gave purpose to his strength. Together they embodied the union of nature and civilization, wildness and kingship, clay and divinity. The people of Uruk, who had prayed for relief, now watched as their king's arrogance softened. Friendship tempered his hunger for domination. With Enkidu at his side, Gilgamesh no longer seemed untouchable, no longer an isolated force of command, but a man capable of loyalty, laughter, and daring ventures. The Mesopotamians who first told this story may have seen in it a reflection of their own lives. Civilization and wilderness were always in tension. The cultivated fields pressed constantly against deserts and steppes. Enkidu's transformation from wild to civilized mirrored the spread of agriculture itself, while his friendship with Gilgamesh symbolized the hope that even the most unbridled power could be tempered by human bonds. And so the two friends stood together mighty and inseparable, ready to seek adventures that would test not only their strength, but the balance between human pride and divine order, heroic deeds and punishment. With their friendship sealed, Gilgamesh and Enkidu turned their strength outward. No longer content with ruling quietly in Uruk, they sought to test themselves against the greatest challenges the world could offer. Together they decided upon a bold quest to slay Humbaba, the monstrous guardian of the cedar forest, a being appointed by Enlil himself. The cedar forest was no ordinary grove. It was vast and sacred, filled with towering trees that reached toward heaven, their fragrance carried by the wind across distant lands. The Sumerians revered cedar as a symbol of divine abundance, for it was wood strong enough to build temples and ships. To penetrate that realm was not just adventure, it was trespass into the very domain of the gods. Armed with weapons forged in Uruk, Gilgamesh and Enkidu journeyed together. When they confronted Humbaba, the monster's roars shook the forest. His face was said to twist with terror, his very presence inspiring paralysis. But the two heroes, emboldened by their bond, pressed forward. After fierce struggle, they brought the Guardian low, defying Enlil's will and claiming victory over a being meant to be untouchable. They felled the cedars and carried timber back to Uruk, their triumph echoing through song and story. Yet the gods are not easily mocked. Their audacity in killing Humbaba stirred resentment in the divine realm, and consequences began to gather. The second great test came with the Bull of Heaven. When Gilgamesh spurned the advances of Inanna, rejecting her love and mocking her past lovers, she seethed with fury. In vengeance, she demanded of her father the Bull of Heaven, a divine beast, whose hooves split the earth and whose breath brought famine. Released upon Uruk, the bull tore through the streets, goring men and collapsing walls. Panic seized the city, but once more Gilgamesh and Enkidu fought side by side. With courage and coordination, they struck down the bull, cutting its massive heart as an offering. Their victory was undeniable, yet their defiance was unforgivable. To kill a beast of heaven to defy a goddess was to provoke divine judgment. The punishment came swiftly. The gods gathered in council, their voices heavy with displeasure. Someone must pay the price for these deeds, and it would not be Gilgamesh, descendant of divinity, but Enkidu, the mortal, who had dared to raise his hand against the divine. He was stricken with illness, his body wasting, his spirit crushed by visions of the underworld. Enkidu's decline was not quick, but lingering. He cursed the trapper who first led him to civilization, cursed the priestess who had tamed him, cursed even the gates of Uruk he had helped to build. Yet as his sickness deepened, he found peace. In dreams he saw the shadowy halls where kings and peasants alike walked in dust, and he understood that no strength could resist death. Gilgamesh watched helplessly as his brother, his equal, his other half, slipped away. For the first time the mighty king felt powerless. All his walls, all his temples, all his victories meant nothing against the relentless grip of mortality. Enkidu died, and with him a part of Gilgamesh's own soul. The people of Mesopotamia knew this grief well. Death came suddenly in their world through flood, famine, disease, or war. The tale of Enkidu's passing was not only a story of punishment, but also a mirror of their own sorrow. The truth that no bond, no matter how strong, could escape the underworld's pull. For Gilgamesh, the loss would mark the beginning of a new journey, one not of conquest, but of desperate search for meaning in the face of death. Gilgamesh's quest for immortality. Grief consumed Gilgamesh. The mighty king who had battled monsters, who had defied gods, now sat broken beside the body of Enkidu. He tore his garments, let his hair grow wild, and cried out in despair. If even Enkidu, his equal in strength, could be taken by death, what hope was there for any man? The walls of Uruk stood tall, but Gilgamesh saw only dust in their future. Mortality had shown its face, and he could not bear its gaze. In his anguish, Gilgamesh resolved upon a desperate quest. He would seek immortality, not glory in battle, not memory in song, but eternal life itself. His journey carried him beyond the known world, across deserts where no water flowed over mountains, where the scorpion men stood guard at the gates of dawn. He passed through tunnels of darkness where no light pierced for leagues, until he emerged at the edge of the sea that bordered the world. There he sought Utnapishtim, the survivor of the great flood, the man whom the gods had granted eternal life. If one mortal had escaped death, then perhaps Gilgamesh could learn the secret. Crossing the waters of death, he came at last to the far shore, where Utnapishtim dwelled in silence, his eyes heavy with the weight of eternity. Utnapishtim listened as Gilgamesh poured out his grief and longing, but his reply was sober. Immortality was not a gift for humankind. He had received it only as an exception, a token granted after the Deluge, never to be repeated. Life and death were woven into the fabric of creation. To unravel them would undo the order itself. Still he offered Gilgamesh a test. If the king could conquer sleep, he might prove worthy of conquering death. Gilgamesh tried, but exhaustion overtook him, and he slept, as all mortals must. When he awoke, Utnapishtim's wife, moved by pity, persuaded her husband to reveal a final secret, a plant that grew in the depths of the ocean, a thorny flower said to restore youth. With determination, Gilgamesh bound stones to his feet and plunged into the waters. He grasped the plant and rose, victorious, hope blazing once more. At last, he thought he had cheated death. He would bring the herb to Uruk, share it with the aged, and restore vitality to his people. But fate, ever watchful, had other designs. On the journey home, weary from his travels, Gilgamesh bathed in a pool. While he rested, a serpent crept near, drawn by the scent of the plant. The snake devoured it, shedding its skin as it slithered away, a mocking symbol of renewal denied to mortals. Gilgamesh, returning to the shore, found only empty earth where his treasure had lain. His last hope was gone. He wept not only for his loss, but for the truth it revealed. Immortality was not for him, nor for any human. The serpent would forever renew itself, but mortals would age, weaken, and die. And yet, as Gilgamesh journeyed back to Uruk, he began to see differently. The walls of his city, the temples his people built, the songs sung in his name, these were forms of endurance. Memory, not endless breath, was the true shape of immortality. A man's life ended, but his deeds could echo, carved in stone, etched in clay, carried in story. The Sumerians who carved this tale into tablets believed much the same. They could not escape death, but they could preserve names in hymns, in records, in monuments. To be remembered was to live beyond the body. And so Gilgamesh returned, not immortal in flesh, but wiser to build, to rule. Justly to leave a legacy was the path by which mortals joined eternity. Order of the Underworld. While Gilgamesh grappled with mortality above, the Underworld itself continued to take shape below. No longer a vague shadowland, it became a structured realm of judgment and balance. The Mesopotamians imagined it not as chaos, but as a solemn bureaucracy, a mirror of their own cities, yet cast in obsidian and dust. At the heart of the underworld stood 7 thrones of black stone, upon which the Anunnaki judges sat. Each soul that entered passed before them, weighed against meticulous records of life. Kings and peasants alike were stripped of their titles, their wealth, their pride. In death, all were equal, their fates measured not by power, but by truth. Presiding over this realm was Ereshkigal, somber queen of shadows. To her side came Nergal, god of war and plague, who once sought to defy her. but instead became her partner. Their union was paradoxical, yet fitting, his fury balanced by her patience, his plague wielded as a tool, not of chaos, but of balance. Through them, the underworld gained not only sorrow, but purpose. For the Mesopotamians, this vision reflected the harsh realities of life. Death was inevitable, impartial, and absolute, yet it was not meaningless. Just as the living world demanded laws, contracts, and judgments, so too did the realm of the dead. To imagine the underworld as orderly was to affirm that existence, even in its darkest phase, retained coherence.
And Nergal's role revealed something profound. Plague was terrifying, yet it was not seen as random. Disease could reduce populations, halt wars, or cleanse excess. It was in myth, a kind of grim governance, painful, yes, but purposeful. Rather than obliterate all with floods, the gods now wielded mortality more precisely, keeping balance without destroying order entirely.
Thus, the underworld became not only a place of endings, but a pillar of stability. The living might fear its silence, but they could also trust in its fairness. Each man, no matter how mighty, would eventually sit beneath its judgment. Each woman, no matter how humble, would walk its dust. In that impartiality lay both terror and strange comfort. Institutionalization of rule. The compounded crises, the revolt of the Igigi, the theft of the me, the flood, Inanna's descent, Enkidu's death, Gilgamesh's quest, taught the gods a hard truth: direct governance was unstable. To walk among mortals, to intervene, constantly invited conflict and confusion. The time had come for a new model of order. The Anunnaki convened and crafted a framework. Kingship would remain, but it would be formalized, its rituals carefully shaped to embody divine sanction. No longer would kings claim authority loosely. Coronations, oaths, and symbols would bind them as mediators, not rivals of the gods. Their power would be sacred, but also limited by duty. Priesthood, too, was elevated. Temples became not merely houses of worship, but repositories of divine will. Priests studied omens, interpreted dreams, read the stars. They preserved hymns, sacrifices, and festivals, ensuring that the gods remained present through ritual, even as they withdrew from daily life. In their hands, memory became power, and power became continuity.
Law was inscribed, not whispered. Decrees that once flowed from divine lips now found permanence on clay tablets resistant to time. The famous codes of Mesopotamia, Hammurabis among them, owed their authority not only to kings, but to the divine assembly that sanctioned them. Justice became not arbitrary, but institutional, a reflection of cosmic order on Earth. This withdrawal did not mean abandonment. The gods still spoke through omens, still acted in crises, still lent strength to rulers and armies. But their involvement became rare, selective, and symbolic. Distance preserved awe, ritual maintained connection. Humanity, meanwhile, gained space to grow, to adapt, to err, and to rebuild. The Sumerians who inherited this framework understood its necessity. In their cities, chaos was always close, flood, drought, war, rebellion. To survive, they needed continuity.
By binding kingship to heaven law, to tablets, and ritual to temples, they created systems that endured beyond the lifespan of individuals. The myths that explained these transitions offered reassurance. This was not mere human invention, but divine will made durable. Thus began the mature era of Mesopotamian civilization, when governance no longer depended on gods walking among men, but on institutions that echoed their authority. It was an age of distance, but also of stability, legacy of mortality, and meaning. With institutions established and distance preserved, humanity entered a new phase. The gods no longer dwelled openly among them, yet their presence lingered in temples, festivals, and stories. Mortality, once seen only as punishment, began to take on new meaning. For the Mesopotamians, death was not simply an end, it was the measure of life. Because lives were short achievements, mattered more. To build a wall, to compose a hymn, to raise children, to preserve order, these became acts of defiance against dust. What mortals could not claim in eternity, they could claim in memory. The myths reinforced this lesson. Gilgamesh, failing to secure eternal life, returned to Uruk and marveled at its walls. His legacy was not in unending breath, but in what he had built in the stories carved into clay. Inanna, descending and returning, revealed that loss and renewal are inseparable. Ziusudra, surviving the flood, showed that even in destruction, life finds a way to persist. Above all, the Anunnaki remained in council, their number 50, their decrees binding. They no longer walked in markets or fields, but their authority echoed in rituals, omens, and judgments. Humanity's role was no longer servitude alone, but stewardship, clay shaped by breath, charged with sustaining civilization under divine watch. The legacy of these stories endures because they capture truths both cosmic and human. Creation is not tidy but contested. Power invites rebellion. Life requires labor. Death is certain, but meaning can transcend it. In myths of flood and descent, of theft and sacrifice, of friendship and grief, the Sumerians gave voice to the questions all mortals face. Why are we here? Why must we toil? Why do we die? Their answers were neither simple nor naive. They saw humanity not as the center of the cosmos, but as part of a larger order, fragile, yet essential, mortal, yet meaningful. Their gods were not flawless, but quarrelsome, passionate, and wise in turns. In them, mortals saw reflections of their own struggles writ large, and so clay-born humanity pressed forward, carrying burdens, raising temples, singing hymns, and telling stories. Each act, however small, was a way of affirming their place in the great design. Each death, however sorrowful, was folded into the rhythm of renewal. In the end, the void was no longer empty. From chaos came order, from silence came song, from mortality came legacy. And in the halls of the Anunnaki, the gods looked down with pride and nostalgia, watching as their clay and breath creations built civilizations that honored them not only through worship, but through the endurance of memory.